Try not to embarrass yourself tonight, Graham.
What did you do?
I invited someone special for you.
Let's begin with a simple first impression game. When I call your table, tell us something about the person seated beside you.
Keep the camera on Graham. Make sure you capture his face, especially when he realizes he can't communicate with her.
What she didn't know was that I had been signing since I was 14 years old. And the woman she'd chosen as her punchline, the one she'd picked off a guest list without a second glance, was about to dismantle everything Brooke had built. So who exactly was Nora Keating? If you've ever had someone use your silence against you, or watched a person take credit for something you built with your own hands, stay with me. This story goes somewhere you won't expect. And if it speaks to you, subscribing to the channel is the best way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. The Briarwood Museum of Design sat at the end of a tree-lined avenue in Columbus, the kind of building that made you feel underdressed the moment you stepped out of your truck. I'd driven past it dozens of times over the years, mostly on the way to job sites, old libraries, community theaters, public buildings that needed someone willing to get their hands dirty. That was my work. Restoring spaces that cities forget about until they start falling apart and then suddenly need saving. I never minded that no one put my name on a plaque when the job was done. I'd made peace with that a long time ago. My mother Elaine had called me 3 times in the week before the gala. She believed that if I showed up, if I stood in the same room as Brooke and smiled and shook hands and acted like a man who had moved on the Whisper network that had been running for 18 months, would finally go quiet. People just need to see you're okay, she told me the last time she called. I wasn't entirely sure I was okay. But I loved my mother and I understood what she was asking, so I put on the one good jacket I owned and drove to the museum. The invitation had come from Brooke herself. Brooke Wainwright, founder of Wainwright Public Image, the most well-connected woman in Columbus's business and nonprofit circles. The note said the event was a celebration of the company's 10th anniversary, and that she wanted to publicly thank the people who had been there from the beginning. I had been there from the very beginning. I just hadn't let myself think too carefully about what her version of thanks might look like. When I first met Brooke, her company was one rented office, 2 employees who weren't sure they'd be paid on Friday, and a lot of ambition that didn't yet have a foundation under it. I was a contractor then, same as now. I'd mortgaged the house my parents left me to help her stay afloat in those early years. Not because she pressured me into it, but because I genuinely believed in what she was trying to build. I renovated her first real office myself over 3 weekends. No invoice. When the company hit a rough patch and payroll looked uncertain, I picked up extra jobs at night to cover the gap without telling her how tight it had gotten. I sat with her at the kitchen table at midnight, helping shape pitches she would deliver alone the next morning. She always delivered them well. I never resented her for that. What I didn't understand until much later was that she had been quietly editing me out of the picture for years. Brooke had a specific image in mind for Wainwright Public Image, polished aspirational, the kind of company that belonged in glossy magazines. A husband who showed up to industry events in a worn jacket and paint-stained work boots didn't fit that image. So, I stayed home. I let her put her name on things we'd built together and told myself it didn't matter because we were a team and teams didn't need a scoreboard. That kind of thinking is easy when you love someone. It's also exactly the kind of thinking that leaves you unprotected. One of the things she eventually put her name on was a story that belonged to my family, specifically to my brother Luke. Luke was 7 years younger than me and had been deaf since early childhood. Growing up learning to sign wasn't something I ever thought about as a sacrifice. It was just how you talked to your brother. We spent years volunteering together at Ridgway Center for Deaf Arts, a community space in Columbus that ran art programs and vocational workshops for deaf children and teenagers. It was the kind of place that operated on a shoestring and meant everything to the families who used it. Luke loved it there. He had a particular way of moving through those rooms, confident, unhurried, completely at home in a way I rarely saw him anywhere else. After Luke was killed in a car accident in his late 20s, I kept going back to Ridgeway because I didn't know what else to do with the grief. So I put it into the building. I redesigned the workshop layout so that teachers and students could always see each other's hands. I installed a visual emergency alert system that replaced the audio alarms, a performance room with a vibrating floor that let the students feel rhythm through their feet, glass panels along the hallways so that signing could continue uninterrupted from one space to the next. None of it was commissioned or paid work. I did it because Luke had once written that a space built for this community should feel like it was always theirs, not a place that allowed them in, but a place that started with them already inside. That sentence stayed with me. It still does. Brooke had always found that work uncomfortable. Not because she was unkind about disability in any obvious way, but because it didn't fit the profile she was assembling. She told me it made me look like a weekend hobbyist instead of a serious professional. When the company started growing and her client list started to matter, she asked me to stop going to Ridgeway altogether. I should have understood what it meant that she could say that to me and expect me to simply agree. The marriage ended when I discovered she had used Luke's image, the Ridgeway designs, and our family's history in a company campaign without asking. She had built an entire pitch around the idea that she was the creative force behind an inclusive community design project, that Luke had been her personal inspiration, that Wainwright Public Image had driven the whole effort from the beginning. I was listed in the supporting materials as a contractor who had handled some of the physical construction. After the divorce, she told people I was bitter and jealous and had never been able to handle her success. I didn't argue with any of it. I thought silence was the cleaner choice, that eventually the noise would settle and Luke's name would stop being used as a selling point. What I didn't account for was that my silence gave her complete ownership of the story. By the time I walked into the Briarwood Gala that night, the ballroom was already full. Long tables with white linen, low floral centerpieces, soft light from above, and the steady hum of 200 people in early evening conversation. I found my place card and sat down, and that was when Brooke appeared at my shoulder with the particular smile she wore when she had already decided how a situation was going to go. She leaned close enough that only I could hear her. "Try not to embarrass yourself tonight, Graham. I invited someone special for you." Then she walked away, moving through the crowd with the ease of someone who had arranged every detail of the room in advance, which I would come to understand she had. The man running the floor that evening was Cole Harwood, Brooke's boyfriend and the head of events at Wainwright Public Image. Cole was efficient, well-dressed, the kind of person who could manage a room of 200 without raising his voice. I had met him once before the divorce was finalized. That night I noticed him moving between tables, checking camera angles, adjusting a tripod near the far wall. The tripod was pointed directly at my section of the room. I assumed at the time it was just standard event coverage. I was wrong about that. The woman already seated next to me hadn't looked up when I arrived. She was reading something on her phone with the focused calm of someone entirely comfortable in their own silence. Her place card read, Nora Keating. When she finally glanced over, she didn't say hello out loud. She signed it a small, relaxed greeting, the kind that assumes nothing. I signed back without thinking. 20-some years of muscle memory. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, but a more specific kind of attention. She looked at me carefully and then signed, "You're Graham Prescott." It wasn't a question. Before I could respond, the host stepped to the microphone and announced that the evening would open with a short icebreaker. Pairs at each table would answer questions about each other based on first impressions spoken aloud for the room. I looked around and noticed that every other table had received small note cards with prompts. Our table had nothing. There was no interpreter standing nearby. The camera across the room was still aimed directly at us. I understood the setup in about 4 seconds flat. The room shifted its attention toward our table with the particular anticipation of people who have been told in advance that something worth watching is about to happen here. I could feel it, that collective lean, that slight drop in the ambient noise. Brooke was standing near the edge of the stage, and she was not watching the host. She was watching me. I turned to Nora and signed, "Do you actually want to play this, or should we let them humiliate themselves?" Nora looked at me for a long moment. Then she laughed, a real one, the kind that breaks across someone's face before they've decided whether to let it through. The room, which had been bracing for something awkward and entertaining, went very quiet instead. Under the cover of that quiet, Nora signed quickly and precisely. She told me she recognized my name from blueprints she had reviewed at Ridgway Center for Deaf Arts original design drawings filed years before Wainwright Public Image claimed involvement in the project. She had visited the center as part of a professional evaluation and had found my handwriting on the design notes in the archive room. Then she told me what she actually did. Nora Keating was an architect specializing in inclusive and accessible space design. She was also the lead evaluator for the Heartland Access Trust, the organization currently reviewing a grant application worth $750,000 submitted by Wainwright Public Image for a campaign called A City for Everyone. The campaign used the Ridgway renovation as its flagship example. It used Luke's story as its founding inspiration. It listed Brooke as the visionary behind all of it. Nora had come to the gala because the documentation in the grant file didn't hold together. Dates were misaligned. Photographs predated the company's involvement. Attribution on the design records had been altered. She wanted to see firsthand how Brooke carried herself around the community she claimed to represent. Within 20 minutes of arriving, Nora had been seated next to the ex-husband as part of what was clearly designed to be a public joke at both of their expense. She signed one more thing before the host called our names. "If you leave tonight, she keeps the story." I had stayed silent for 18 months. I had watched Brooke turn Luke into a tagline, watched her collect recognition for work she hadn't done, watched her describe our marriage to clients as the weight she'd overcome on her way to building something meaningful. I had convinced myself that staying out of it was the mature choice. What I hadn't let myself see was that my silence wasn't protecting anything. It was just making it easier for her to keep going. I looked across the ballroom at Brooke. She was still watching me, still waiting for the scene she had engineered to deliver what she expected. The camera was ready. The room was ready. She had planned every detail of this evening. I straightened in my chair and told Nora I wasn't going anywhere. Brooke moved fast. I'll give her that. The moment she realized the room wasn't reacting the way she had planned, that there was no fumbling, no awkward silence, no footage worth editing, she walked to the edge of the stage and took the microphone from the host with the smooth confidence of someone reclaiming a conversation that had briefly gone off script. She thanked the host warmly, laughed in the direction of our table, and told the room that she had always known her ex-husband had picked up a few basic signs over the years. The way she said it made the whole thing sound charming and minor, like a party trick he'd learned at a weekend class. She was reframing the scene in real time, folding it into her narrative before anyone had the chance to interpret it differently. Then she turned toward Nora and introduced her as an incredibly inspiring woman, with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent a decade learning how to make people feel acknowledged without actually seeing them. She didn't ask Nora's name. She didn't ask what she did. She didn't ask whether Nora wanted to be introduced at all. She simply described her and moved on the way you might gesture at a piece of artwork that supports the theme of the room. Nora requested the floor through the event interpreter, who had been stationed near the side wall, the one who had been conspicuously absent during the icebreaker segment. The interpreter relayed her words clearly into the microphone. "I'd like to ask you something directly." Nora said her signs steady and precise. "Why did you think placing a man next to a deaf woman was a setup for a joke?" The room went still in the specific way that happens when a question lands that no one had prepared an answer for. Brooke's smile stayed in place, but the quality of it changed. She said the question was based on a misunderstanding that the whole segment had been a light-hearted moment designed to help people connect, and that she was sorry if anyone had read it differently. Then, before Nora could respond, Brooke pivoted and looked directly at me. She said I had always had trouble accepting her success. She said that was the real story of our marriage. Not sacrifice, not partnership, but a man who showed up late to everything and then expected credit for the foundation. She said I had never once sat in a strategy meeting, never contributed anything that could be called vision, and that the work I did at Ridgeway had been contracted labor the same as any job I took for a paying client. She said all of this calmly, and without raising her voice in the tone of someone finally telling a truth they had been too generous to say out loud before now. I sat with that for a moment. The problem wasn't that the accusations were hard to hear. The problem was that from the outside, from where the rest of the room was sitting, they sounded plausible. I had no contract with Ridgeway because I hadn't wanted one. I had no formal credit on any of the Wainwright campaigns because I had genuinely believed that a marriage didn't require a ledger. The things that would have proven my version of events were exactly the things I had never bothered to keep because I trusted the person I was keeping them with. I could see a few faces in the room, shifting, not hostile, just uncertain, waiting to see which version of the story would hold. That was when Nora walked to the stage. She signed to the interpreter and her words came through the microphone without hesitation. She told the room who she was, not as a formality, but because it was necessary. Her name was Nora Keating. She was an architect with 15 years of experience in accessible and inclusive design, and she was the lead evaluator for the Heartland Access Trust, the organization currently reviewing a $750,000 grant application filed by Wainwright Public Image. The energy in the room changed the way pressure changes before a storm, not loudly but all at once. Nora laid out 3 specific concerns she had identified in the grant file. The original design drawings for the Ridgeway Center renovation showed evidence of authorship edits, names removed and replaced in a way that didn't match the file creation dates. Photographs submitted as documentation of Wainwright Public Image's creative involvement carried metadata timestamps predating the company's first recorded contact with the center. And the written narrative describing Luke Prescott as Brooke Wainwright's personal source of inspiration had been substantially rewritten from an earlier draft that identified him differently as the brother of the project's lead designer. She then turned to me and asked if I was willing to speak to the origin of the project. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I had carried that notebook for years without thinking much about why it was just one of those habits you develop when you work with your hands, writing down measurements and material lists and things people say that you don't want to forget. Inside were the first sketches I'd drawn for the Ridgeway renovation done at the kitchen table in the months after Luke died, when I needed something to do with the hours I couldn't sleep through. There were pages in Luke's handwriting, a list of suggestions he'd collected from students and teachers at the center, things he'd wanted to change about the space before the accident took away his chance to change them. There were invoices I'd paid out of pocket, a photograph of the 2 of us installing the light alert system on a Saturday morning, with coffee cups balanced on the subfloor, and one folded piece of paper on which Luke had written, "Don't build a place where others allow us to enter. Build a place that was always ours." I hadn't planned to take that notebook out in a room full of strangers. I hadn't planned to hold up my brother's handwriting under a ballroom light and explain to 200 people what it meant and where it came from. But I looked at the photograph in my hand, Luke, with his sleeves rolled up, grinning at something off camera, completely at home in a building he was helping to make better, and I thought about what Nora had said to me at the table. If you leave, she keeps the story. I described each item without drama. The sketches came first before any company letterhead existed. The notes came from people who used the center gathered by my brother over the course of months. The invoices had my name on them and no reimbursement record because there had been none. Nora confirmed for the room that the design concepts in the grant file matched the sketches in my notebook, with a precision that could not be coincidental. Brooke's composure finally cracked not into emotion, but into action. She signaled to someone near the AV station, and within seconds, the large screen behind the stage filled with the Wainwright Public Image project file, official documentation signed, contracts with the center, a timeline of company involvement, and digital signatures on revised design documents bearing Brooke's name. She stepped back to the microphone and told the room that I had removed files from the company server after the divorce that I had coordinated with Nora before tonight, and that what was happening was not a truth-telling but an organized attempt to sabotage a legitimate business and the community campaign it was built around. She mentioned the word lawsuit once deliberately, in the way people do when they want its weight in the room without having to commit to it yet. Several of Brooke's partners began calling out from their tables. One asked Nora to consider the possibility that a personal dispute was being used to undermine a valid grant process. Another suggested the documentation questions could be handled through proper channels privately rather than in the middle of a gala. The room was fragmenting. I could feel the ground shifting again, the uncertainty redistributing itself among the crowd. Then the screen changed. Brooke had cued a promotional video part of the grant submission package, the kind of polished 2-minute film that turns a project into a mission statement. Luke's face appeared on the screen. A photograph I recognized from a family Christmas, cropped and placed beneath a title card. The voiceover described him as the inspiration behind Brooke Wainwright's commitment to inclusive design. It described her as the person who had taken his story and built something lasting from it. The voice was warm, sincere, and entirely fictional in the way it arranged the facts. I asked them to turn it off. Brooke said no. She said the video was produced for a professional submission and represented the company's truthful account of the project. She said the story of Luke Prescott had been incorporated into a formal campaign with the knowledge of the family and that the authorization paperwork would speak for itself. My mother stood up from her seat near the center of the room. Elaine Prescott had spent the better part of the last 18 months urging me to stay quiet, to let things settle to protect the family from becoming a public story. She was the reason I had come tonight. She was also, it turned out, the reason the voiceover could claim family authorization at all. Brooke had approached her in the weeks after Luke's funeral with a request to use some family photographs for a memorial tribute. My mother had signed a release form without understanding what the footage would eventually become. She told the room this herself, standing straight, not looking at Brooke. She said she had believed she was giving permission for a remembrance, not a sales tool. She said she had told her son to stay silent for too long and that she was sorry for it. Brooke said it had all been done in good faith. She said misunderstandings happen in grief and that no one had acted with malicious intent. She said this directly to my mother, and something about the gentleness of her tone made it worse the way she could reach for reasonableness at precisely the moment it would do the most damage. That was when Cole walked to the front of the room. I had watched him all evening managing the logistics of the event, adjusting the camera, coordinating the host moving between stations, with the focus of someone executing a plan. What I hadn't known, and what he was apparently no longer willing to leave unaddressed, was that the plan he had been executing was not the one he had agreed to. Cole took the interpreter's microphone. He told the room that he had organized the seating arrangement for the evening at Brooke's direction. He had been told to position Graham Prescott next to a deaf guest to ensure the host called on that table during the icebreaker, and to keep the camera trained on Graham's face throughout. He had also been told not to arrange an interpreter for that portion of the evening. At the time, he said he had thought it was Brooke's awkward attempt at matchmaking. He had felt something was off. She had asked him to make sure the camera captured Graham's expressions specifically, but he hadn't asked the question he should have asked. Cole opened his phone and read 2 messages aloud. The first, "Put him next to the deaf woman. Graham won't know what to do. We'll have the funniest clip of the night." The second, "If he walks out, even better. Everyone will see exactly what kind of man I had to deal with." Cole also provided access to a shared project folder, the original archive for the Ridgeway campaign, showing the file history of the design documents. The metadata was unambiguous. The earliest versions carried my name. 3 weeks before the grant application was submitted, those files had been accessed, and the attribution had been changed. The revision history had not been cleared completely. It never is. The Heartland Access Trust representative, who had been sitting near the back of the room, stood and announced that the organization was suspending review of Wainwright Public Image's application, effective immediately pending a full documentation audit. Two of Brooke's longest-standing business partners quietly gathered their things. The host did not return to the microphone. A member of the event staff began removing the company logo from the screen behind the stage. I should have felt something like relief. I had stayed. I had not left the story to her. The room now knew a version of events that was true, and it had come from multiple sources, not just from me. But the video had not been fully cleared from the queue, and for a moment, maybe 10 seconds, maybe less, Luke's face was still on the screen. Frozen. Displayed above a ballroom full of people who were now talking about grant fraud and corporate liability and what this meant for Brooke's client relationships. His photograph taken at a family Christmas years ago hanging in the middle of a room where it had been weaponized and then exposed, and was now simply suspended in the aftermath of both. That was what I hadn't protected him from. Not the lie I had come tonight knowing there was a lie to correct, but this. The specific indignity of his face becoming a piece of evidence. His memory becoming the centerpiece of a scandal. I had thought that staying and telling the truth would give him something back. Instead, I had watched his name pass through 3 different versions of exploitation in the space of a single evening, and the last version had happened while I was standing in the room. I set the notebook down on the table. I walked out through the side corridor, past the coat check, and into the back section of the museum where the restoration work was still ongoing, exposed brick-covered floors, the clean smell of raw material that hadn't been finished yet. I leaned against the wall in the dark and understood for the first time that night what losing actually felt like when the scoreboard said you had won. I don't know how long I stood in that back corridor before I heard footsteps. The restoration section of the museum was unlit except for the emergency strips along the baseboards, and the floor was covered with protective paper that crinkled underfoot with every step. I knew it was Nora before I turned around, not because I heard her, but because I felt the shift in the air the way you learn to when you've spent enough time around people who move with intention rather than noise. She found me leaning against a section of exposed brick wall, still holding my jacket in one hand. She didn't sign anything at first. She just stood in the low light and looked at me the way someone looks at a person they're deciding whether to be honest with. I told her I was thinking about going to the press. I had the text messages Cole had read aloud, the file metadata, the invoices, the notebook. A journalist with any instinct at all could turn that into a story that would follow Wainwright public image for years. It wasn't an idle thought. I had been turning it over since I walked out of the ballroom, and the logic of it was clean. Brooke had used every tool available to her. I finally had tools of my own. Nora listened, then signed one question. Do you want people to remember Luke for what he built or for the scandal that was built around him? I didn't answer right away. The question didn't need an answer immediately. It needed to settle, which it did somewhere in the space between my ribs. The truth was that I had spent 18 months being angry in private and saying nothing in public, and I had told myself that was restraint. But restraint and avoidance aren't the same thing, and I had been confusing them for long enough that I'd stopped noticing the difference. My silence hadn't protected Luke. It hadn't protected the community at Ridgeway. It had simply left a vacant space where the true story should have been, and Brooke had filled that space with whatever served her. I had handed her the pen and then been surprised that she used it. But Nora's question pointed at something I hadn't fully looked at yet. If I took every private detail, every financial record, every message, every document that showed what Brooke had done inside that marriage, and fed it to a reporter, I would be doing the same thing Brooke had done, using Luke's story as ammunition, choosing the version of events that served me rather than the one that served him. That wasn't what he would have wanted. I knew that the way you know things about someone you grew up beside without needing it written down. I straightened up, put my jacket back on, and told Nora I was going back inside. The ballroom had quieted by the time I returned. The promotional video had finally been cleared from the screen. Small groups of people stood in corners, talking in the low, clipped tones of people processing something they hadn't expected the evening to include. Brooke was near the far wall with 2 of her remaining staff members, and she looked for the first time in the years I had known her like someone who didn't know what came next. I asked the event staff to cut the remaining branded displays, The logo panels, the company signage, the framed campaign materials along the side wall. A few of them looked to Brooke. She didn't object. I think by then she understood that the room had shifted in a way she could not reverse by asserting authority over the AV equipment. I took the interpreter's microphone and said 3 things. The first was about Nora. I told the room that she had not been brought to this event as a test of my social skills or a prop in a story about my ex-wife's generosity. She was a professional with 15 years of expertise with a career she had built on the actual needs of actual people, and she had come here tonight as an evaluator doing her job, a job that Brooke's arrangement had been designed to undermine by making her a punchline before anyone in the room had the chance to understand who she was. The second was about Luke. I said his name clearly and told them who he actually was, not an inspiration, not a symbol, not the emotional foundation of a corporate mission statement. He was a person. He had opinions about bad coffee and strong feelings about the acoustic properties of certain performance spaces, and he had spent years collecting suggestions from deaf students about what a center built for them should actually feel like, because he believed that the people using a space were the only ones qualified to define what the space needed. The designs at Ridgeway came from that process. They came from him and from the community he was part of. They did not come from a marketing meeting. The third thing was harder to say, but I said it anyway. I told the room that I had allowed my name to be removed from more things than I could count over the course of 9 years because I had believed that loving someone meant making yourself smaller so they could be larger. I had thought of it as generosity. It wasn't. It was a slow erasure that I had participated in willingly, and the result was that when the erasure became deliberate and systematic, I had no record left to point to. I wasn't saying that to excuse what Brooke had done. I was saying it because I had come to understand that the story of how I ended up invisible was not entirely someone else's story to own. I put the microphone down and said what I wanted to happen next. The original design records from the Ridgeway renovation needed to be formally returned to the center's archive with accurate attribution. Luke's image and personal history needed to be removed from every commercial application in which they currently appeared. Any revenue generated through the use of the project in grant solicitations needed to be audited. And from that point forward, any decisions about how the story of Ridgeway Center was told would belong to the community. It served the teachers, the students, the families, the people who had been in those rooms every week while the walls were still being built. Brooke stepped toward me. Her voice was quieter than it had been all evening, stripped of the professional warmth she had been projecting for hours. She asked me to tell the room that she had made mistakes under pressure, that it had come from ambition rather than malice, that she had genuinely believed in the work, even if she had gone about it the wrong way. She was asking me to give her a soft landing. I looked at her for a moment before I answered. "This wasn't a mistake," I said. "A mistake happens in a moment. You planned this, assigned the pieces to other people, and set up cameras to record the humiliation. You knew what you were doing each time you made a decision that got us here. I'm not going to call that something smaller than what it is." She didn't respond. I didn't wait for her to. My mother was waiting near the edge of the stage. Elaine had been sitting with her hands folded in her lap since she stood up and spoke, and she looked both exhausted and strangely relieved, the way people look when they've finally done something they should have done a long time ago and can't unknow the cost of the delay. She reached for my arm when I came down from the stage, and I let her hold it, and neither of us said anything for a moment that stretched long enough to mean something. She told me she was sorry, not in the way people say it when they're trying to move past a thing, but in the way that means they've actually looked at what they did. She said she had put the family's reputation above her own son's, and she had known somewhere underneath the reasoning that it was wrong. I told her I understood why she'd done it. I also told her I needed her to understand that understanding why someone does something and accepting the cost of it aren't the same. She nodded. It was the beginning of something that would take longer than one night to repair, and we both knew it. Nora returned to the microphone one final time and addressed the room on behalf of the Heartland Access Trust. The review of Wainwright Public Image's application was suspended indefinitely. However, and this was the part I hadn't anticipated, the trust had a standing interest in funding projects that demonstrated genuine community partnership. If the Ridgway Center for Deaf Arts wished to pursue a direct application, the organization would be willing to engage. The process would need to be led by the community, evaluated on the actual work rather than the narrative surrounding it, and structured so that the people the center served were the ones making the decisions about what it became next. Nora looked at me when she finished and signed one word, "Well." I said yes, on one condition: that I was there as a builder, not a brand. The community at Ridgway would lead the project. I would handle the structural and technical work. My name did not need to be on the door. 6 months later, a decommissioned rail station on the east side of Columbus was midway through becoming the new home of Ridgway Center for Deaf Arts. The bones of the building were good wide floor plates, high ceilings, large windows that flooded the interior with natural light. What it needed was someone who knew how to listen to a space and to the people who would live inside it, and then build accordingly. The design process took 4 months before a single wall was touched. Teachers came with lists. Parents came with questions. Students came with drawings of what they wanted their rooms to look like. A group of teenagers spent 2 evenings debating the acoustics of the performance space and concluded that the floor needed to be suspended slightly raised from the substructure so that vibration could travel through it cleanly. They were right. I built it the way they described. The workshop that opened onto the central courtyard carried a small placard beside the door. Dark wood, clean letters. Luke Prescott Workshop. I had made the sign myself on a Saturday morning alone in my garage, and I had taken longer than necessary with it because I wanted to get the grain of the wood right. There was no dedication ceremony. No one gave a speech. It was just there when people arrived, the way the best things in a building are just there already, part of the place, as if it couldn't have been otherwise. At the main entrance, mounted at eye level, was a sentence carved into a panel of reclaimed oak. Luke had written it years ago on a folded piece of paper I had kept in a notebook ever since. Don't build a place where others allow us to enter. Build a place that was always ours. His name was beneath it. Mine was not. On the day of the opening, a boy of about 10 came up to me near the courtyard. He signed with the focused energy of someone who had recently learned that communication was something he could move through the world with, rather than something he had to wait for others to provide. He asked if I was the one who had built all of it. I told him no. I told him everyone here had built it together. I had just been the one who knew how to listen. He seemed to accept that as a reasonable answer and moved on back toward a group of other kids who were testing the resonance of the performance floor by stamping in different corners and comparing what they felt. I watched them for a while. Nora was standing a few feet away. She had a particular way of reading a finished space, moving through it, slowly running a hand along a wall here, checking a sight line there, like she was verifying that what had been built matched what had been intended. She caught me watching the kids and signed, "It worked." I told her I thought it had. What Brooke had arranged that evening at the Briarwood Museum was supposed to prove something about me, that I was graceless, isolated, unable to connect with someone whose experience differed from my own. She had chosen Nora as evidence of my limitations. What she had not considered was that the capacity to actually hear another person not perform, hearing not demonstrate it for a camera, but genuinely let what someone else knows change what you do next, was the only thing that had ever made me any good at the work I did. She had set a trap to show the room who I was. She just hadn't known me well enough to know what they would find. If this story stayed with you, I think it's because some part of it felt familiar. Maybe you've been in a room where someone tried to make you small. Maybe you've stayed quiet for too long, telling yourself it was the mature thing to do while someone else rewrote your story. Maybe you've given your best years to something or someone and watched the credit disappear. What Graham's story teaches us is simple but not easy. Silence doesn't protect you. It just hands the pen to someone else. And the truth doesn't have to be a weapon. Used with intention, it can be the thing that finally builds something worth keeping. If that's the kind of story you want more of, real human without easy answers, then subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And leave a comment telling me, have you ever had to choose between staying quiet and speaking up? I read every single one. We'll see you in the next story.